will arrive in the next few minutes. So let me welcome everyone to this webinar on investment facilitation for development, revitalizing investment for COVID-19 recovery. I'm Carl Souvon, resident senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University. This webinar is part of the ITC DIE project on investment facilitation for development. The project focuses on assisting developing countries in capacity building in matters related to investment facilitation, especially in the context of the WTO negotiations on investment facilitation framework for development. And it focuses especially on promoting sustainable foreign direct investment. Yeah, then if it is possible, maybe you can put the link to the volume into the chat box that brings together the results of the project. In this session, we will discuss where we stand with the negotiations of an investment facilitation agreement and what the challenges are in implementing investment facilitation measures. This is a particular challenge, as we know that world foreign direct investment flows have declined substantially and continuously during the past 5 years, and of course, especially during the pandemic, from 2 trillion in 2016 to 1 trillion last year. This is a substantial decline indeed, and developing countries in particular need more foreign direct investment, sustainable foreign direct investment to be precise, to advance their development. Not surprisingly, therefore, developing countries have initiated in the WTO an effort aimed at an agreement that seeks to facilitate FDI flows. The agreement is focused entirely on practical, technical issues related to facilitating investment flows, and it explicitly does not deal with such controversial issues as market access, investment protection, and investor-state dispute settlement. We have a stellar cast of speakers to address these questions. I don't have to introduce them, as their bios are part of the program. One more thing, though. You, the participants, are encouraged to put questions and observations into the question and answer or chat box, whatever is appropriate. Well, let's begin with Dorothy Tembo, the Deputy Director of the ITC. Dorothy will set the scene by speaking about the importance of investment facilitation for development in enhancing resilience beyond COVID-19. Dorothy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carl, and a very good afternoon, good morning from whichever part of the world you are joining us from. A real pleasure for us at ITC to partner with DIE in the context of the work that we have been doing in relation to investment facilitation, but more particularly in relation to this particular session. And to begin with, I think we all agree that investment facilitation is good for development. Otherwise, we would not be having this conversation this afternoon. And I just wanted to make that my starting point, assuming that we are all on the same page. Why do I really say that? And I wanted to illustrate this by speaking to 4 points by way of sharing with all the participants, but knowing and understanding that there are many, many other reasons that we could advance to justify this particular issue. But in the interest of time, I will just speak to those 3, then wrap it up with 2 issues that I would put on the table for purposes of our being forward-looking, which will be picked up by others. My first point touches on the issue that you already spoke to, Carl, which is that we are in challenging times, and we need to take urgent measures to arrest the dramatic fall in investment that you just spoke to. We have seen that in the context of COVID over the years, as you said, but more so in this particular period, there has been a fall of 1/3 of the foreign direct investment. In value terms, we could translate that to a value of $1 trillion, particularly in 2020. Obviously, this creates problems for countries that are already facing challenging situations, but more so also for those economies that may already have been graduated from receiving ODA. We all know that even those that are providing that ODA are actually particularly challenged during this time. And therefore, it means that we are now confronted with a situation where we have increased competition in as far as attracting investment is concerned. And we need to make sure that we are moving in a direction where we are not only looking at this issue in a more critical way, but trying to find solutions of addressing it, but also understanding that we will need to make a case even more in the current context when you take into account that there are equally important but conflicting demands that are also coming in this context. Good developments that we are trying to find good solutions that can help us to address some of the challenges. In particular, I wanted to speak to the digital, the focus on the digital side. It's good that we were able to find a good way of trying to, as an interim, because this is, to me, is not a holistic solution in terms of addressing the challenges, but by doing so, it enlightened the fact that we perhaps needed to have more investment in areas such as that. That in itself could potentially create additional challenges in terms of the resource base that we have and accessibility to that. So any effort that we can make to ensure that we are boosting confidence of would-be investors is a step that we should indeed encourage. Second point I wanted to make in relation to investment facilitation is that in itself, to us, it's an important policy tool to improve the overall business ecosystem. From making investment-related information more easily available and transparent, that in itself is helpful for those that would like to utilize the provisions or regulations that go with that, but it's also about reducing the red tape, as well as helping investors navigate the complex regulations that are associated not only with investment, but also with the many, many other demands that often come with regulations. So it's important that we are not only ensuring that we are working with the different partners to try and make them first and foremost understand their own context, but moving towards a solution-oriented phase. And here we would also be looking at assisting investors to amicably resolve complaints, because this is really something that is expected of any arrangement that is in place. Important for me to make, important point to make at this juncture is the fact that it is critical from our perspective, because we believe that this is one way that we can stimulate both domestic and foreign investment. And I wanted to stress the domestic side, because oftentimes when such measures are put in place, we forget that actually they can have a positive impact on the domestic front, which is also equally important in terms of galvanizing. One aspect I also wanted to conclude on this point with is the fact that we strongly believe that such measures would be ones that are more effective in ensuring that we get foreign direct investment coming, as well as stimulating the domestic side, as I have said. but it is also an aspect that we think is sustainable, unlike in situations where we sometimes have very specific FDI incentives put in place, which sometimes are required, but are not sustainable from our perspective. Third point, which is more important, is the specificity or trickle-down effect that all these measures would have in as far as micro, small, and medium enterprises are concerned. We're not only moving into a direction where we have more transparency in as far as the investment environment is concerned, but it's also about ensuring through this process that we are increasingly ensuring that micro, small, and medium enterprises are integrated into the regional and global value chains, because this is really where ITC and institutions that are like us are really wanting to see that result, because that's what's going to create that impact on the ground. So very important. What do we do in terms of going forward? Two very quick points. Here, we obviously are engaging in conversations that want to lead us in a direction where we consolidate the efforts that are being made, because it is true at national and regional levels, there are steps that have been taken. And I wanted to share with you a bit of examples coming from my continent, which I'm more familiar with, but I also know that beyond my continent, there are many, many efforts that are being made that we could draw examples from. I look at Algeria, Egypt, Kenya, Namibia, Tunisia. They're already taking unilateral steps to try and improve their own investment frameworks, and indeed, by so doing, creating that enabling environment. At the regional level, you have the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa that have created a common investment area. And this relates to 21 member states that are already a party to this. In the context of West Africa, we have ECOWAS, which have also done the same with the support of the EU and the World Bank. As we have for East African community taking similar steps, which should be applauded, but at the same time, I think more needs to be done, particularly for Africa. An opportunity, a good opportunity has been created in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which should give the 53, 54 member states to consolidate those efforts and engage and have more people on board to ensure that they indeed are in a position where they're creating an environment that is good for regional integration and an environment that is good for regional competitiveness. But that's not enough, which brings us to the multilateral level, where we have particularly been interested, because I think that that multilateral context would provide more predictability. And here I wanted to acknowledge the work that is being done by the able leadership of Ambassador Frankie. They're making good progress. It's not easy when you're bringing 100 countries together with different interests at different levels of development. So we understand that, but any step that is taken in a direction where we are consolidating our efforts is a good one, which is why we at ITC and indeed DEI have been so keen to support the different stakeholders, particularly to support the negotiators and the policymakers in enhancing their negotiating capacities through the various activities, which range from training, workshop, and roundtables. And we remain very committed to doing that. I would want to end by saying I highly recommend that our publication on investment facilitation for development, a toolkit for policymakers, is one that all of us should strive to have access to and see what we have put together in terms of supporting these efforts. Investment facilitation for development is a must-have in my view. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for your opening intervention. and for setting the scene. You made one reference in your presentation, which I wanted to follow up. We know that foreign direct investment accounts maybe for about 10% of total investment. In other words, domestic investors, domestic firms are really the most important investors. And you did make reference to that actually an investment facilitation agreement negotiated in the WTO and focused on foreign direct investment can also be of benefit for domestic investors. Can you just elaborate a little bit on how they can benefit?
If I'm to take the example of me being at a country level, I think first and foremost, the situation we have at present is one where a number of steps have been taken, but sometimes taken in not a very coordinated manner, which makes it very difficult. Second, there's so much unpredictability to any of the regulations that are put in place. So for would-be investors, they've found it very hard over time to really have an understanding of what is pertaining and how that would really enable them to be able to conduct business in such an environment. Moving forward, I would say still the regional dimension remains important for me because that's one step up where you're trying to provide predictability to the rules. And when you're defining those rules, I don't believe that you would only be defining in relation to international trade per se. You would be looking at investment in its totality. And if government moves in that direction, there is that predictability. It creates that enabling environment for one to know, if I go in, this is what will happen as an international investor. But for the domestic players as well, they too will know that there are efforts being made to enable businesses to thrive in an environment that supports local business to do business within, but local business to also do business beyond the borders, because this is really what everybody is looking at present. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful. Can we now turn, please, to Ambassador Franke? Ambassador Franke is the ambassador of Chile to the WTO, and he is also the coordinator of the structured discussions, or actually the negotiations. From what I understand, the negotiations have made tremendous progress in the past few months. So, Ambassador Franke, what is the state of play of the WTO negotiations on investment facilitation for development ahead of the 12th ministerial conference? And maybe also, what do you expect from the conference? Matthias, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you for you, the ITC. Dorothy, thank you very much for your kind words, and for the German Development Institute for your continued support to this process, discussion, negotiations, as you say, Carl. You have been very key in helping participants and non-participants to better understand many of the issues being discussed and to advocate for what we are doing. So thank you very much. And we hope you will continue counting on your vast experience. I would like to raise 6 points that may contribute to today's debate. On the state of play, yesterday in another panel, I gave a comprehensive explanation on where participants stand and what are the next steps. So I can share with you my speaking notes, so no need to repeat everything what I said there. I just want to emphasize that after a year of negotiations, the group has reached a point in which almost clean texts have been sort of agreed on 3 of the main pillars as instructed by ministers in the 2017 and 2019 joint ministerial declaration. That is elements to improve the transparency and predictability of investment measures in section 2 of the Easter text, the need to streamline and speed up administrative procedures and requirements, that's section 3 of the Easter text, as well as provision to enhance international cooperation, information sharing, and exchange of best practices, Section 4 of the Easter text. The group has also reached a clear understanding on other provisions such as domestic regulatory coherence, firewall provisions to clarify the relationship and interaction between the IF agreement with existing WTO provisions and current investment commitments among members. Finally, the group has well advanced discussion and even text on the preamble language, the scope, and what is excluded from the agreement. That means market access rights, investment protection, and investor-state dispute settlement. So we can say that an important part of the homework that was given us by ministers have almost been done. Second point, since the beginning, the discussion has proceeded under the premise that in order to facilitate greater developing and least developed members' participation in global investment flows, their requirements in implementing the multilateral framework shall be assessed so that technical assistance and capacity building can be made available to address those needs. We will focus our discussions in the months to come on SNDT, technical assistance and capacity building, particularly on the basis of recent proposals by Dominica and Grenada, Laos, PDR, and Cambodia. My assessment is that we have a good understanding on the general principles that should illustrate the implementation of the agreement by developing countries and LDCs. Third point, participants have also stressed the importance of sustainable investment for the development policies and objectives. Foreign investors should abide by certain international recognized principles, standards, and guidelines on responsible business conduct, and members should adopt measures to prevent and combat corruption. The specific formulation of the respective provisions are still being discussed. At the same time, inclusiveness is a concept that goes hand in hand with sustainability. So I would like to hear views on how we can produce an agreement that is also inclusive, taking into consideration our MISMIs. There are some reference to them and their particular needs in the text, and women, besides a possible reference as one of the RBC principles. So I'm looking forward also to Valeria's presentation on this point. 4, all in all, participants are committed to have a strong outcome by MC12 in the way of as clean as possible text so ministers can take note of the progress and give political guidance for the last part of the negotiation. Fifth, when launching the process, ministers decided to develop a multilateral framework on investment facilitation for development. Hence, the discussion have and will continue to be transparent, inclusive, and all open to all WTO members. But that also leads us to the issue on how to incorporate the final agreement into the WTO architecture, a more political question that is still to be resolved. So I also very much appreciate ideas on this topic that could guide our discussions in the negotiations. A final point of transparency. Carl, you have asked more than once when the Easter text will be made public. A recent article, I can see your face. I guess you were laughing, yeah, or smiling at least. A recent article compared the Easter text with other chair's texts that have been recently produced and circulated in an open manner. Let me say first that the Easter text is not a chair's text. In many issues, it includes clean provisions that were general understanding of where there is general understanding after long discussion. But in others, it just transcribes proposals from members and attributions because participants are still reflecting and discussing them. It is up to members to decide if their proposals are to be made public or not. The coordinator cannot decide that through the Easter text. But having said that, throughout the process, the annotated agenda and the summary of the proceedings have always been open and circulated to everybody. So everybody can have a better understanding of the dynamics in the negotiation. And Carl, I think I leave it for here and open for questions, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for a very clear presentation of where you stand and what you expect. And thank you also for making reference to the repeated suggestion that the text be made available. And you know, as the ancient Greeks and Romans said, a steady drip hollows out a stone. In this case, maybe a steady drip will eventually convince your colleagues in the negotiations to make the text available. In particular, as you mentioned, you have a almost clean text with the core provisions, substantive provisions agreed upon. So obviously, we are all dying to see what it is that will come out of the negotiations. But I think precisely because the negotiations are so far advanced and the contours of an agreement are becoming clear. In fact, more than the contours, the specifics of an agreement are becoming clear. It is very important to know where countries, individual countries, stand as regards the level of implementation of some of the measures that are being foreseen in an agreement. And I think this is precisely where Axel comes in, because Axel has made, is in charge of a substantial research project looking precisely at this question. So, Axel, could you please speak about implementation gaps of investment facilitation measures and technical assistance needs? Axel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carl, for the kind introduction. And I think I have to play the academic here on the panel. So let me share a presentation with you. So, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel and talk about implementation gaps and needs for technical assistance. So I think my starting point is that we heard that the negotiations are making very good progress. So it's high time to reflect on the implementation of a future IFD agreement, the challenges countries may have, and the support that they may need to overcome those challenges in implementing the agreement and the provisions of the agreement. My presentation is based on an investment facilitation index that we've developed at the Institute, at the German Development Institute, which quantifies the level of adoption of over 100 investment facilitation measures at country level. The link will be posted on the WTO session web page. I will develop my presentation in 3 steps. So here's the first step. To what extent are investment facilitation measures are actually adopted already at the moment? I will use our IFI, so the investment facilitation index, to show that there is a strong correlation between the level of development and the adoption or non-adoption of investment facilitation measures. So just have a look at this spider web, which displays key investment facilitation policy areas, and you will see that the poorer countries are, the fewer investment facilitation measures they have in place. This is important, in particular if we discuss their likely challenges to implement a future IFD agreement. So let's go one step further. Step 2, what are the reform gaps countries face when signing up to a future investment facilitation for development agreement? The bar charts display the current level of adoption, the gray bars. It's the same picture as before. The poorer the countries, the fewer measures they have implemented. The red and orange bars for different scenarios of a future WTO agreement show that especially developing countries on the left side of the bar chart would have to undertake significant reforms to implement additional investment facilitation measures as part of an IFD agreement. At the same time, the higher reform pressure also implies higher benefits from an IFD agreement for developing countries. And CGE modeling work of my colleagues show that these benefits are sizable, especially for developing countries. But only if countries are able to implement the provisions of an IFD agreement. And many of them may need the support.
Axel?
So
Axel?
step 3, in order to defend.
Axel? Sorry.
Carl, yes?
Yes, can you go back to the previous, please?
Sure.
Yeah, just to make sure I understand fully, the dark red area is actually signifies the lack of implementation of a particular measure?
Exactly. So what we did here, we simulated the effect of an agreement on the countries. And these would be the additional provisions the country would have to implement.
Okay, yeah. And as you said, it shows clearly that, starting on the left side with Benin and Liberia, these are least developed countries, they have most to do, so to speak, in implementing investment facilitation measures.
That's true. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. Just want to make sure I understand.
It's important to clarify this. I have only one further step to go. So let's zoom in. What happens at the country level? Here I compared the level of adoption of a country X, an anonymous LDC, with the provisions are most likely to be adopted in a future IFD agreement. The green lines are the measures from the IFD agreement that the country X already adopts. So here the country's investment framework is already consistent with the future IFD agreement. So IFD consistent, the green lines. And country X already implements 17 measures that are part of the draft IFD agreement. So interagency coordination, for example, establishment of inquiry points, advanced publication of drafts of investment regulations, and so on. The orange and red lines are more challenging. Here, the investment framework of country X is inconsistent with the IFD agreement. So it's IFD minus, I would say. The orange lines show which best endeavor provisions of the agreement, and the red lines refer to the binding provisions of the agreement that are not yet implemented by the country. So country X, for example, does not implement 15 best endeavor measures, including electronic payment of fees, online portals for submission of applications, and so on. And country X does not yet implement, and perhaps that's more important, more critical, 13 binding measures of the IFD agreement. So, for example, when a focal point responds to inquiries or information regarding the status of application, and so on. As you can see from these examples, these are challenging measures that require administrative capacity, political will, and technical and financial resources to implement. It is quite understandable why these measures are not yet implemented, and that's why I would encourage that or argue that a firm and substantial technical assistance provision should be in place to enable countries to sign up to and implement a future IFD agreement. Furthermore, and that's my last point, we need a clear picture where countries stand and what kind of support they need. I would therefore argue also in favor of a thorough gap analysis and needs assessments to be conducted during the negotiations phase, if possible. Thank you very much, Karl. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Axel. I think your study is really very powerful in showing that there are quite substantial gaps when it comes to implementation, and that these gaps, not surprisingly, are of course particularly to be found in least developed countries. And of course, least developed countries are the ones that face the greatest challenges in implementing any new measures for lack of capacity or limited capacity. And of course, as was mentioned at the beginning by Dorothy, the issue is not only to get more FDI, but sustainable FDI that makes as much of a contribution to the sustainable development of host countries. So let's focus in our next presentation, please, on the question of strengthening the development dimension, important, effective, and innovative investment facilitation measures to incentivize sustainable FDI for sustainable development. And the topic will be introduced by Valeria Mendes Costa, who is the first secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. And as we know, Brazil is one of the key drivers of the negotiations of an investment facilitation agreement. Valeria, please.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers as well for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel. Before I start, I want to make a disclaimer, just to say that the opinions that I will express here today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, I also divided my presentation in 3 parts. I want to start by briefly mentioning the main sustainable development provisions that we have in the text under discussion. Matthias Frank has already mentioned many of them. I'll just say a few words more. Second, I would like to say some words on what else could have been included or could still be included in the agreement, and finish with some personal comments on how I feel these discussions so far and how they will go on. So first, the revised Easter text contains provisions on sustainable development. Of course, the preamble of the agreement contains direct references to sustainable development, and it is possible to say that the interpretative frame of the future agreement will be informed by this concept. In the objective as well, the aim of fostering sustainable development is also clearly stated. There's a provision on responsible business conduct, as Mathieu has already mentioned. This provision aims to signal the type of investment that members want, and is also, in my view, a reminder of the shared responsibility of investors and home countries in the success of a long-term investment relationship. There is a provision on domestic supplier database, which aims precisely to promote the linkage between foreign firms and domestic suppliers. And this is an important tool to reduce information gaps and search costs for identifying local suppliers. You mentioned before, and I think Dorothy also mentioned the SMEs. SMEs are of special concern here in this kind of provision. We also have a large session on special and differential treatment and on implementation. Of course, special and differential treatment is essential for the success of these negotiations. They have been treated during the negotiations and in recent meetings. And I think the discussion now, how I see it, is how to find the right balance between, on one hand, the demand side and the offer side, and also how to find the right balance on the need to implement the agreement in phases and also the effectiveness of the agreement. Recently, 2 members proposed new provisions on sustainable investment. Ambassador Frank has also mentioned. One of them on supplier development programs as a component, as a complement to the domestic supplier database. And the idea is to increase the number of local firms that could contract with foreign investors and so help them to be linkage ready. There was another proposal on home state obligations. The concept is that home states should also play a role in facilitating sustainable FDI. In this provision, members are encouraged, for instance, to adopt certain measures to facilitate outward FDI, and also are encouraged to share information on the operation of their investors from their territories, including with respect to responsible business conduct and sustainable investing. Well, the second part of my presentation, I think that to make the agreement even more development friendly, other measures could still be included in the text, and some of the existing provisions could be more ambitious. Dorothy mentioned the importance of this agreement for domestic investors and how they can contribute to increase the investment flows in the countries. I think that we could have had in the agreement a provision encouraging more cooperation among agencies, you know, because sometimes investors and also domestic investors have to navigate through complex legislations and a multitude of agencies. And many times these agencies do not communicate with each other. So the agreement could have had a provision enhancing further coordination domestically. Maybe members could also have thought about providing additional facilitation measures to investors who meet specified criteria, okay? I understand that investment facilitation is not trade facilitation, but we could be inspired by the TFA's authorized operators and at least have an encouragement in the text for members to adopt similar schemes. oh, to have a domestic supplier database, I think it's already a victory, you know. But the step further would be to develop this database also using sustainability criteria. So in addition to traditional information on sector of operations, scale, goods and services furnished, other criteria could also have been considered for inclusion in the database, such as environmental management, water usage, employee care, training, gender equality, and so on. I know that one of the members, WTO members, already have such system in place. Technical assistance and capacity building are drafted to help developing countries to implement the agreement. But in my view, these two provisions still do not envisage enhancing the country's ability to facilitate sustainable FDI. I think it would be important to further enhance this perspective. It would also be necessary to have a needs assessment during the negotiations to better structure not only technical assistance and capacity building, but also implementation. And to finish, before I conclude, investment committee, I think, can play a more prominent role to reinforce the sustainability dimension. We could have a built-in agenda directly to promote sustainable development facilitation measures. Savad Suad, the investment committee, will work to implement the agreement, but I think that a built-in agenda directly prescribing future work on this topic would be very welcome. To conclude, I think the sustainable development dimension is present on the text in these negotiations, but I think that the provisions are few and still limited in ambition. Why? On one hand, because for many members, this agreement is essentially about enhanced transparency and predictability of investment measures. And on the other hand, because the development dimension gained more interest late in the process. Not only very few members proposed text on sustainable development, but also developing countries engaged very late in these negotiations. I don't want to finish in a negative mode. So I think there are, of course, challenges to overcome in these negotiations, but I sincerely hope that members can still agree on provisions to further enhance this very important dimension in the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for a very rich intervention with all sorts of interesting ideas. There's one aspect I wanted to ask, actually, Matthias. You focused on sustainable development and sustainable for indirect investment. I'm not an expert on WTO law, but it's my impression that in the context of this investment facilitation agreement, the issue of sustainability, not only in general terms, but also in specific terms, is getting, relatively speaking, to other negotiations and discussions in the WTO, a lot of attention. Matthias, is that correct?
Yes.
So you're a pioneer.
Sorry.
So you are a pioneer.
Sort of. Yeah. Yes. I'm members of Pioneer. I'm just coordinating a group of participants. But yes, we are a pioneer in many areas. No, I mentioned responsible business conduct. I mentioned anti-corruption. The specific mention to the special needs of MISMIS. I think those are things that for the first time being seen in a WTO agreement or agreement negotiated in WTO. On sustainability, yes, of course, environmental sustainability is an issue that is growing. A lot of members are already engaged in dialogues on plastics, on climate change, on a broad agenda on environmental sustainability. So there's expectation for MC12 to have something more concrete in this kind of dialogues, probably establishing working groups or a more structured discussion to have this, particularly on climate change and particularly probably on plastics. I think those are the two issues that are, or the two topics that are more advanced in the conversations.
Thank you. Can I go back to Valeria, please? Valeria, since you had such a rich set of ideas, of course, supplier development programs are particularly important because they upgrade domestic firms and therefore contribute very much to the development of the host country and also link domestic firms to global value chains. Can you say a little bit more about this home country measures idea, meaning that, if I understand it correctly, that home countries, meaning the countries where multinationals are headquartered, could also encourage the firms to do more in the direction of not only to facilitate outward investment, but also do more in the direction of facilitating sustainable foreign direct investment. I guess you are thinking about, for instance, environmental impact studies before they finance a project or something like that. Is that sort of the idea?
Yes, Carl, I think that's the idea. We had a member proposing home state obligations recently. And the idea is precisely to engage home countries to also promote not only FDI, it's because we don't want any FDI. We want the foreign direct investment that promotes effectively development. And the idea there are in this provision there are some more concrete proposals on how to engage the responsibility of home countries. And there is an understanding that many times investment will not happen if there is not a support from the home country, because the investment would be seen as riskier and difficult to invest. You know, so it would be important for home countries to facilitate that investment and also to promote investment, sustainable investment by risks assessment, helping the investor to understand the local legislation on responsible business conduct, on work in coordination with home countries, host countries and home countries to promote more sustainable development. That would be the idea.
Thank you for the explanation. And my guess is that is particularly important for SMEs that don't have normally the resources to figure out what they can do in a particular host country and what kind of investment opportunities exist. Well, thank you to all the speakers for your interventions. I would like to give the speakers an opportunity to comment on each other's intervention, but I also want to see, I have to ask Yarden. Yarden, do we have any questions? I'm sorry to say I haven't managed to get access to the question Q&A box on a separate platform. It was a little bit too sophisticated for me, but Yarden has kindly agreed to do that and monitor the chat box or the question and answer box. Yarden, are there any questions? And can the technical staff please allow Yarden to intervene?
Yeah, I see there are a few comments about technical issues, but there are no substantive questions yet.
Okay, in which case I want to encourage the speakers. Anybody, any comments on what was said by the colleagues?
Could I?
If
Carl,
not,
I had a few comments that I wanted to
please,
just
Dorothy, thank you.
Thank you very much. There were 2-3 issues that I wanted to make as observations. I think one aspect that I wanted to highlight, I think with respect to how quickly we advance to get, some kind of agreed framework within the context of the WTO. We really have to get to a point where we have something that we can present to countries that gives them the encouragement to have that buy-in. Unless there's something that they see in it for them, the buy-in will not be there. And I think from where I sit, it's important, I think, to engage as we are engaging at the WTO level, But what we have seen, particularly in relation to the work we did in the context of the trade facilitation agreement, when we went to the ground, we were able to not only do the assessments, as Axel was making reference to that, but from there that you are identifying very specific areas of support and you zero in and they can actually see the value of what you're trying to bring to them or what value any of the discussions would really bring to them directly. With that, I think the response was much more positive. So what is it I'm saying? I think we need to have the Geneva front proceeding with the conversation, but it's equally important that we are already moving to the ground and trying to ensure that we are already providing some kind of technical assistance that enables countries to have a better understanding of the context. It's a reality that many of these countries, particularly the LDCs, may not even be understanding the full implications of what is being discussed on their own countries. So if we can do that with any interim support that could be provided, that would be very useful. In doing so, if we take the approach that ITC took, which was not only to do the needs assessment, but to also address the institutional strengthening that Valeria spoke about, that is also something that we should be moving towards. Within that context, that you are having the right dialogue that goes beyond your initial entry point and ensures that at the country level, there's a coherent approach to addressing matters relating to investment, I think would be useful. But going beyond that, obviously, it's the reforms that were spoken about that also need to be addressed. As an observation outside perhaps my formal presentation, coming from a country that is categorized as an LDC, I think it's important that when we're finding solutions or agreeing to certain provisions, we take into account what is existing on the ground, especially as it relates to addressing sustainability aspects. Because in some cases, it is about a situation that is prevailing, which is so demanding that governments have to respond to. And we have to be very careful as to how we introduce the commitments in as far as the sustainability side of issues is concerned. What is it that we can do in the immediate term? What is it that we can do in the medium to long term? So a progressive approach. And in this respect, I would believe it would be linked to the discussions on the S&D side of things, because it's a reality. There is a problem. There are communities that are not only vulnerable, but disadvantaged. What is it that can be offered in the immediate term? I think it's a good idea to move towards the sustainability aspects and making sure that we are progressively entrenching this. What we have actually seen from our side is that it's not only a demand, particularly in as far as it relates to technical assistance, a demand coming from those providing the resources. It's an increased demand coming from the countries themselves because of the situation that they have been confronted with at present. They want to do better going forward, but let's be realistic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. And actually, we have a question here from the participants, and it builds actually on what Dorothy said. The question is, and it's directed, I guess, to Matthias. In the negotiations text, are there any obligations on other WTO members to provide technical assistance and capacity building to LDCs and developing countries? Matthias, brief answer, please, because I was reminded that we have to conclude in 3 minutes, and I want to say at least thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we're discussing, as I said, SNDT and using the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement model with categorization. Yes, one of the principles is, of course, I mean, the developing countries, particularly LDCs, but developing countries in general, will have provisions in order to have some flexibility to implement the provisions of the agreement. So in that sense, capacity building and technical assistance will be provided or shall be provided. That's the question, and how mandatory is this? But it will be based on developing countries' needs assessment of their needs in terms of what do they need to do and what capacity and what financial resources will need to do to implement certain provisions. They will be able to choose which provisions they will need more time and more technical assistance than others. Just a comment regarding the presentation of Axel and also Dorothy. This process, we don't need to forget that this comes from experience sharing. No? This is a long process of conversations, and developing countries, particularly developing countries, brought their experience on implementing these kind of measures based on the support of ITC, UNCTAD, World Bank, and others. As Axel's study showed, no, there are still gaps, but a lot of developing countries have already done part of the job. So that's important, and this agreement will reflect that. And going to Valeria's presentation, certainly some of those ideas have been discussed, but the participants in general felt that could be good issues for a future work program that could be agreed together with the agreement. But certainly they go beyond what's probably the basis for having investment facilitation measures. So that's why some of those ideas haven't got traction. And some of them are also sort of contentious, but that's for another session probably. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And let me thank also the other panelists and the participants for being in this webinar. I think it's clear from our discussions that the negotiations on an investment facilitation agreement is an important undertaking, and it's an agreement that is particularly important for developing countries. And of course, it's important to get it right. Since we have heard and we know that many developing countries and these developed countries in particular lag behind in the implementation of various investment facilitation measures, I think it becomes particularly important that the agreement contains, as Axel said, firm and substantial technical assistance and capacity building commitments. And we also need to keep in mind that actually implementation in the case of an investment facilitation agreement is much more challenging than the implementation of the trade facilitation agreement, because the trade facilitation agreement basically focuses on border issues, while implementing an investment facilitation agreement involves a range of behind the border issues throughout the life cycle of a given investment. And of course, that makes implementation of an agreement more challenging, and especially for least developed countries. Let me, by way of concluding, also reiterate an aspect that I think is really important, namely that it looks as if the agreement would introduce the concept of sustainable foreign direct investment, or in any case, focus on sustainable development in a concrete, not only in abstract, but in a very concrete manner. And I think that would be pretty much a breakthrough, in my opinion, for the WTO in general. And as was pointed out by Matthias and also by Valeria, hopefully the investment facilitation commission that is foreseen in the agreement will be able to build on what has been achieved and further strengthen the facilitation of sustainable foreign direct investment for sustainable development. Well, let me close the webinar with these words. Thanks again to everyone, and I wish everybody a good rest of the day. The webinar is concluded. Thank you very much also to the technical staff and to the interpreters for their work on this. Thank you, and bye-bye.